Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks all of you very much for coming. We're going to spend 1 hour talking about one of the best new ideas in the world to make global labor mobility work better. And we're going to do that with five of the smartest people in the world on that subject. My name is Michael Clemens. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. And in 2006, Center for Global Development published a book by Lant Pritchett called Let Their People Come. That book pointed out that making global labor mobility work better is basically an unstoppable force hitting an immovable object. And the one example of the unstoppable force that we're going to talk about today is demographic change. For a number that springs to mind is that in Europe, the number of workers per elderly person is going to collapse from 3 to 2 over the next 30 years. There's going to be huge demand for more workers in Europe. And of course, the immovable object is the global wave of anti-immigrant sentiment, exemplified not least by the recent executive orders in the United States, essentially ending migration for the time being. Um, that that might bring to mind the question: is this the right moment to be talking about ideas to make global labor mobility better? You know, after Land wrote his book, there was a global economic crisis, 2008, 2009, 2010. That wasn't the right time. In 2015, there was the refugee crisis in Europe. You know, that wasn't really the right time to be talking about it. Now there's the COVID crisis, and that's really not the right time to be talking about it. Apparently, the right time never arrives. I, I say to you, this is the time. Today, this moment is the time to be talking about it because we're running out of time to be building the institutions that are needed to make global labor mobility work better. That can be done. And what's really exciting is that a new form of institution, a new international institution that Lant proposed in his book, is actually being built right now. And the first two speakers we've got today are the two co-founders of Labor Mobility Partnerships, or LAMP, that institution. They are Rebecca Smith, who's the executive director, and Lant Pritchett, who is the research director. They're going to tell you about that organization, and today they are releasing the feasibility study describing how that organization can be shaped. And along with them, we've got three of just the very best people on earth I can think of to discuss this subject. Senator Ratno Midvar, senator for the province of Ontario in Canada. Gonzalo Fanjul, who is co-founder of Por Causa in Spain, and Julia Onslow-Cole, who is a partner at Fragaman, which is the world's largest firm specializing in immigration law. You can see we've got government, private sector, academia, NGOs, a wide range of thinkers on these issues. And I just can't think of anybody better to talk about this exciting new idea. So as I say, we've got an hour total. Starting in about half an hour, we're going to be able to have a Q&A, and I think on screen. Before I began talking, there were the instructions to do that. I'll just repeat them now. You can submit questions three ways: by email to events@cgdev.org, cgdev.org. You can tweet to the hashtag CGDTalks, that's CGDTALKS, or you can submit comments on YouTube. I think that's it. I think we can go right to Rebecca and Lant right now. Go right ahead, Rebecca or Lant.
Okay, sorry, I was muted.
Oh.
So I want to start by laying out the very big picture, sort of from an economist point of view, and partly from an economist point of view, what drives successful and opportunities for exchange is differences. And as we look from now to the future 30 years from now, one of the biggest differences that exist in the world is the demographics of the now rich countries and the currently poorer countries. And the future of the rich countries is older, much older. And what that means is, since essentially the social contract of the social protection schemes, health, pension, insurance, is built on a sharing of the responsibility between the young and the old, the dramatic fall in the number of young will make it nearly impossible for the currently rich countries to sustain anything like their current social contract without massively larger numbers of young workers in the workforce age than are going to be produced by the natural demographic forces of birth and death. So as you look at the UN standard population projections, what they show is that over the next 30 years, in the absence of migration, the OECD, the sort of club of rich countries, is going to gain about is there a way I can see the slides? Because even though I, so next slide. So they're going to gain about 96 million, about 100 million older people are going to be present in the population of the OECD countries. And if you think about the way in which those older people are currently supported, you currently need about 3 working age people to pay the taxes and do the work to support those older people. So 100 million more older people are going to require about 300 million more additional workers in the labor force. But that's not what's going to happen. Rather than having 300 million more workers, these countries are going to have 92 million less workers. This creates roughly 30 years from now, there's going to be roughly a 400 million worker gap between the kind of, in some sense, minimal amount of workforce one would need to sustain the existing social contract and what will be happen given the demographic realities of the world. And that's just a massive gap. It's twice the total current level of workers living abroad in the world today. And it would require, if one were going to accumulate that over the next 30 years, millions and millions of people moving in and out. Now, the second half of that, next slide, is that it's not as if the whole world is on the same demographic trajectory. So rather than, as in the rich world, there's going to be an inversion of the demographic pyramid in which the number of old grows, but the number of workforce aged shrinks absolutely. Over the next 30 years, there's going to be 1.4 billion new working age people in the low income countries. So rather than seeing their labor force shrink, they're going to see their labor force expand dramatically. 700, almost 700 million just in sub-Saharan Africa, almost 500 million just in South Asia. And on the current projections and trajectories of the standard types that are being made, the most pressing issue for the poorer countries is going to be finding employment for all of these people. On the current trajectories, something like 600 million of this incremental labor force are going to find a difficult time finding regular employment. So what we have is on one level a mismatch, but on another level, it's the mismatch, it's the differences that create the opportunities for people to exchange. And so we have a massively growing demographic imbalance in the rich world, in which the inversion of the demographic pyramid means there are many more older people that are not going to have anything like the supporting younger people that were there, that are there now and were there when the social contracts around how pension systems, how health care, how health insurance was going to work was designed. And at the same time, it's not as if this is a global phenomenon. Globally, many countries are still going through the phase of an expanding demographic pyramid and hence are going to create an enormous number of new workers, not all of whom will be able to find productive employment on current projections. And what that creates is a massive, massive opportunity for an industry for good. The next slide, which means the, the historic opportunity is that because of these differentials in productivity across countries, massively high labor productivity in rich countries across the skill levels, and unfortunately low productivity of labor across skill levels, it means that you know the ability to increase your productivity of a person in a poor country, the massive opportunity for increasing your productivity is to move from a low productivity place to a high productivity place. So even if I'm in favor of education, much of the work I do is on education, but if you look at what it would mean to go from being a low skilled worker to the highest skilled worker in Ethiopia, you gain about $2,000, which is a substantial gain. It's worth investing in. But even if the highest skilled person in Ethiopia were able to work even at a lower skilled job in the Netherlands, the gain would be 10 times as large. So there are currently massive wage differentials that are driven by productivity differentials. People are just fantastically more productive in rich countries than they are currently in the poor countries. That will change over time, but these gaps will persist over the next 30 years, which means if you allow people to move from high population, high youth population, low wage places to low youth population, high wage places, it creates massive new wealth in the economy. So if we assume that the stock of migrants is going to be higher by 400 million to meet the demographic gaps in the rich countries, and we assume even half of that is taken by rotational temporary labor mobility and half is probably the more skilled worker, permanent citizenship change type of mobility we're used to. But if half of that is rotational mobility and the average gain per worker is on average 15,000, which Michael and I and many others have done research in every way, which is a really modest number of the gain in productivity. And I'm emphasizing that the gain in wage is driven by a gain in productivity, so it creates net new wealth in the world. That's a $3 trillion annual flow gain to be had in the world. And the entire GDP of sub-Saharan Africa is 1.7 trillion. The entire GDP of India is 2.7 trillion. So the world has the opportunity to add to the world wealth, to add to global productivity, an economy the size of all of Africa, or an economy, or almost twice the size of all of Africa, and an economy the size of India can be added just by facilitating and allowing the flow of workers from low productivity places to high productivity, where the youth are there in abundance in the currently poor countries and are increasingly scarce in the rich countries. So that's the industry that could exist. And I want to now turn to Rebecca to talk about the need to create, in order for this industry to exist that can create this good, we need to create a good industry. Rebecca.
Sorry, there we go. So we can go to the next slide. Lent has told us that there is a massive, massive need for labor mobility. And it's really difficult even to accurately impress on our audience how quickly those changes are coming and indeed already happening. The second thing he's told us is that labor mobility is a powerful and historic force for good. And yet, despite this, despite the fact that receiving countries, sending countries, workers, employers, and what we refer to as mobility industry, or let's call them the people who move people, all have a vested interest in building a globally mobile workforce, we don't see any of these actors actually taking significant steps towards making that happen, and certainly not towards making it happen in the needed time frame as we flag in this report. So we brought together a working group, and really the purpose of the working group was to answer the questions of why aren't these actors taking these steps, and then what support could be provided that would help them towards building the needed mobile workforce and unlocking all of these gains that Lant has told you about. So on this slide, you'll see our answer to the first question, why actors aren't currently taking the needed steps to prepare for this future. The first set of constraints are what Michael previously referred to as the immovable object. So this is really, I think, what we can all easily recognize as the most binding constraint around labor mobility. And political and reputational constraints relate to not only the negative perceptions of publics around both the economic and cultural and social impacts of migrants in high-income receiving countries, as we're currently play out, as Michael has already flagged, but also concerns around abuse of migrants and rights concerns, as well as trust that mobility programs will work the way that they are intended to. For example, the often quoted, though false, belief that overstay of migrants is inevitable and there's nothing so permanent as a temporary migrant. We're all familiar with these being very binding constraints. We're familiar especially with how they're binding on government officials, having seen, for example, the resignation of the Belgian Prime Minister over signing the Global Compact on Migration, or even some politicians receiving death threats over their support for migrants. But it's important to point out that actually these are also very binding constraints for other needed actors like employers and mobility industry representatives who are concerned about the backlash on their own business from either being seen to welcome migrants or being seen as abusing migrants as part of their workforce. Operational constraints, the second bucket, relate to the fact that labor mobility is a highly fragmented space. So first of all, due to both a lack of information and awareness, and then even more so misinformation, there's first a lot of lack of awareness of actors on their own needs and how labor mobility might be able to help them. Where they are aware of how labor mobility might be able to help them and they want to act on it, because it's a fragmented space, they either don't know that other partners are available, or what we've heard time and time again is they might know of someone they want to work with, but they're not able to bridge that gap. And then even when all of these pieces are in place, labor mobility programs are simply very complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces that need to be brought together to make them work. And then the final bucket is financial constraints, which is simply that current existing financial tools are not necessarily, that are used in other development or labor market programming, are not necessarily well equipped for these types of cross-border movements. And then, of course, there's simply a lot of risk involved if you're not assured as an actor that you're going to see the other actors do what would be needed to make your financial investment pay off. So one of the things to flag is that in the current COVID era, we're likely to see, in fact, we're already seeing these constraints becoming more binding. We've all seen, as Michael has pointed out, the increased political backlash against migrants. We're all seeing movement become more operationally tricky as planes simply stop flying. However, as all of the demographics that Lant told you previously still hold up and are still true. So let's move to the last slide and we'll wrap up here. In this discussion around these constraints, we came up with a number of functions that could answer these constraints for a broad coalition of actors. These again fall into three buckets, and you can find more about these on Labor Mobility Partnership's website, as this is essentially a roadmap of our future plans. So the three buckets first relate to brokering, which is meant to overcome that fragmentation and those gaps between actors. So this is meant both to expand the number and build the capacity of actors in the space. That's the industry that Lant is referring to, and identify opportunities for partnerships and really build a community of practice between policymakers, employers and private sector representatives, mobility industry, and migration and researchers and advocates. Technical support is meant to overcome those operational gaps, help people understand what their needs are and how to overcome them. And then finally, research and advocacy is meant to really use the evidence through the activities undertaken in the first two buckets to build a positive evidence base of just these enormous gains that Lant has told you about, and then to feed the evidence of those gains into the public discourse so that we can really shift that narrative, shift the dynamics around the immovable object, and see if we can't just move it after all. So we're going to end here and hand it over to our very distinguished set of panelists, but please do reach out to us if you want to learn more at info@lampforum.org or just visit lampforum.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Lant, for that really just crisp and compelling introduction. I want to remind people listening that you can submit questions by email to events@cgdev.org or tweet at the hashtag CGDTalks, CGDTALKS, or on the YouTube channel. So I want to start with Senator Omidvar, please. Senator, you have been working for many, many years on these issues in Canada and around the world. I'm particularly interested in what you could see as the role for a new international organization. What are the political challenges of labor mobility as you see them now in Canada and around the world, and what could be the role of something like LAMP?
Thank you, and thank you, Michael, for inviting me to be on this panel. So you've heard from Lant and Rebecca, outstanding economists and researchers, and a terrific report. From me, you will hear the perspectives of a politician. And as we can all appreciate, politics is not dominated by anything as much as it is dominated by the electoral cycle. But even this political conversation, at least in Canada, and I observe around the world, has been transformed and disrupted in an unimaginable way during the crisis. And I happen to agree, Michael, with you that if a crisis brings disruption, it also brings an opportunity, and this could be the opportunity that we have to grab. I'm just going to speak very briefly about Canada before I get to the question about LAMP, because Canada is, continues to be in an interesting place, like the rest of the OECD countries, many of them. We have a huge reliance on immigration. We do not call them migrants as much as we call them immigrants, for good reason. We have a commitment in large scale to permanency for a very good reason. Our economy, our labor market, our population, our senior citizens, etc., etc. At this point, Canada is incredibly worried that it is not going to meet its immigration numbers and targets, and we have documented evidence of the negative impacts on our recovery. So to that end, Canada has again shifted very rapidly, very flexibly to new policies and processes. And in that context, we have surprisingly put many previously held sacred cows out to pasture. But there is a huge amount of uncertainty, which drives the political uncertainty about this. And I think this uncertainty is shared around the world. We don't know when borders will happen. In Canada, and I imagine in the United States, we don't know if temporary foreign students continue to favor sending countries. We, frankly, in Canada, our biggest challenge today is our relationship with China. We're at a huge standoff with China because of an extradition process involving the founder of the daughter of the founder of Huawei, and in return, Canadians have been held on spying charges. And this is maybe a story no one else knows, but the immigration numbers from China are huge in our country. So I think politically, as we look for new alliances, we may look for new source countries to reduce our over-reliance on one or two or even three primary source countries. Mixed into all of this is what is happening in Hong Kong. We expect more asylum seekers from Hong Kong. We also expect more Canadian dual citizens returning to Canada, and that will be a good thing for Canada. And then there is President Trump. We experienced a Trump bump in immigration in 2016, and we're predicting we will experience another Trump bump. So there are some accidental factors flowing into this conversation. But what we don't know, and politically, this is what is really consuming us in this country is we don't know if the rage and frustration of Black and Indigenous communities through the Black Lives Matter movement and the conversation on racism, whether it will have a positive or a negative impact on the political and public will. So lots of unknown knowns, as someone has said. I do want to point out that Canada has been incredibly flexible in the way during this crisis to keep Canada attractive. I'll just give you a few examples. So for instance, Canadian students have all received a benefit during the crisis to make up for lost wages because there are no summer jobs or a dearth of summer jobs. That benefit has been extended to foreign students as well. We are considering a new immigration class for agricultural workers, not as temporary, but as permanent residents. And asylum seekers who are really at the, I would say, at the lowest rung of our immigration ladder, uh, and those who put themselves in harm's way in Canada working as healthcare attendants may find a route to permanency. And just yesterday, and this is really interesting when we consider new sources of labor market migration, Canada announced that we will reach into the refugee community in camps overseas and bypass the very convoluted refugee resettlement process and use the skilled immigration process by matching refugees to jobs, which is completely new for us. What the discourse in Canada is not yet about, and in fact has never been, is about the impact on sending countries. And I believe that the focus on agriculture and health, this conversation must start. So to get to your question, and maybe this is where LAMP comes into you asked Michael a question, what about LAMP? LAMP talked about the need, about the industry, about global migration being an industry, and it is so. It is fragmented, but it is an industry. And he noted that this industry can, under certain conditions, be a force of good for all. But I would submit that every industry needs an institutional base that proposes standards and criteria, that provides models of good governance, curates existing research, convenes, builds capacity, and focuses on charting workable solutions to sticky problems. In terms of global migration, these sticky problems are well known to us. Undocumented migrants, temporary foreign workers with limited rights, high-skilled migrants who are not able to practice their professions in source countries. And just looking at these issues, we need a broker who can put together small or big coalitions of the willing and work with these, whether these are bilateral arrangements that could be amplified and ramped up, or mini multilateral arrangements who do the same things. So I think of LAMP as a proxy for a center of excellence on labor market migration. This is an empty space, so I don't think of it as a think tank. I certainly hope you will not be a think tank just. I don't think of it as a research organization either, but a combination of a think tank, a research tank, and a do tank. I hope that answers your questions, Michael.
Spectacularly, thank you. I really appreciate it, and you bring up the coalitions. I want to direct a question specifically on that to Gonzalo Fanjul, co-founder and head of research for Por Causa in Madrid. Gonzalo, you've just worked incredibly fruitfully and energetically on these issues for many years. You heard Rebecca talk about the fragmentation of this space. What would it take to put together a coalition for changing the narrative around migration, for changing migration policy in difficult environments, and how could an organization like LAMP play a role?
Right, thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. And I must say, I was amazed listening to Radna. It was really, really inspiring listening to her on this. And I mean, I thought LAMP was a fantastic idea from the very beginning, because this is very much the incarnation of something that I have learned in my professional career and working with many of you for many years, trying to reform our current migration system and trying to introduce rationality in a system that for many reasons is immoral, but it's basically idiotic from a rational point of view. I think it doesn't work for the benefit, fully for the benefit of all parties. No? So in that regard, we have learned some lessons that I would like to share with you, among others, one particular regarding the coalitions and the role that LAMP could play. No? We are now actually, let me tell you a little bit about a process where we are right now in Spain, which is a process of regularization of migrants. We are trying to move this debate forward, trying to do something along the lines of what countries like Portugal and Italy have already done. Using LAMP's image before, this would be like bringing, like giving birth to almost 400,000 people, 80% of them under 30, that would be productive, that would be contributing to social security from the very first day. So there are only good news from the economic and the fiscal perspective in that regard. No? So the kind of things that we have learned is, first of all, that you need to get your facts right. I think that you need to have the kind of good research that LAMP is providing in terms of the data, in terms of the policy alternatives, in terms of what the public opinion thinks in this regard, which is something that is very critical for the second element of what we are trying to do, which is segmenting our audiences, not talking to everybody as if everybody was the same, but rather knowing how your audience thinks and what kind of messages would be more appealing to them in terms of this reformist effort. No, so I mean, in a very simple way, we divide the audience into three big parts: the lovers, what we call the lovers, the people that are always going to support these kind of things; the haters, the kind of national populists that will never support this; and then we focus on the middle. This is what we are interested about, and that middle, according to some organizations like More in Common, for instance, in many European countries, is something around 40–60% of the population who have the heart in the right place, but do not necessarily support this kind of reforms that we are arguing for, because they have very legitimate concerns about how this is going to impact their employments, about how this is going to impact the sustainability of their health sector. So you need the kind of arguments, not just rational arguments, not just the kind of data that we can produce, but emotional arguments that can allow them to move from the fear to the expectation, to the opportunity. And that is what we try to do, to construct messages adapted to these people. No? The third element that we do is to try to build alliances in that regard. No? If you allow me to show you something that LAMP will probably remember, because this is an exercise that we did together many years ago. And this is something that we have done for this regularization campaign, and answers your question here. No? If we had to map the different actions, the different actors in this debate, in this map where you have the pro-reform people or pro-reform groups, the anti-reform group, and why they are in each of these camps, either it is because their ethics and ideology or because of their self-interest, what we need to do, and this is to us the key to build those coalitions, is to identify where are the binding constraints, what are the key obstacles or the key moves that you need to push. No, so if we have to look at the leftist parties like Podemos in Spain, which is a party that would always, I mean, the lovers in that regard, but this is a party that, from an economic perspective, is a protectionist party. Is some kind of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, if you know what I mean in this regard. They are not so in favor of going too far in the liberalization of labor mobility. No, we should look at what the liberals think. The liberals are always a fundamental ally in this regard. In general, the center right could be an ally for economic reasons, and we need to target that. We need, of course, to work with employers and with trade unions in this. We need to think how activists and people that are now, for instance, in churches, are in favor of regularization, but when they make a maximalist approach to these debates, sometimes they are more of a problem than they are part of the solution, because they really make people fear what would happen if everybody should have all the rights immediately. And so we need to pace this kind of, so we build the coalitions using exercises like this that I was mentioning. No? Now, sorry, I don't want to get very long on this, Michael, but on the basis of this, we build narratives that we call substitutive. So we do not engage in answering narrative frameworks that are actually anti-migration. We do not spend time trying to explain why migrants are not rapists or they are not going to take all our employments. We try to build alternative narratives that would replace those ones. And then when you have done all that, when you have gotten rid of all these obstacles, this is when you have the possibility to work on a more sophisticated approach, particularly with willing governments and willing coalitions, the kind of things that we are talking about. And this is what I think that the role of organizations like LAMP can be absolutely critical in providing this brokership, in providing the technical assistance, in providing the kind of policy innovation that is desperately needed in countries like mine. I would argue that in the European Union, in general, this is certainly the problem. We are dealing with a challenge of the 21st century with a policy framework of the 19th century, and this is where I think that we can introduce all those elements. No, so I mean I couldn't welcome more an initiative like LAMP, the kind of things that an initiative like this is bringing in the debate, and I can very well see how this is in very practical terms useful for a context like ours, not just Spain, but in general, I would argue the European Union.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo. We've got some really thoughtful questions pouring in from the audience, and I thank you all for those. But first, I want to go right to Julia Onslow-Cole. Julia, I wish that I could just sit here for the rest of the day and learn from your expertise on this, but I just want to ask you a kind of a narrow question, which is, you work with private sector partners all of the time. Can you talk a bit about how employers are seeing these long-term challenges of workforce, the short-term challenges of barriers in the current crisis, and what kind of role that a new organization like LAMP could play constructively?
Thank you. I've got 4 points. I think the first thing is that employers are really reeling from the economic fallout of COVID-19. I mean, governments all around the world have had to shut down their economies, and few businesses have actually managed to grow during this period. And many are facing, a lot of really tough economic decisions and economic hardship. I think in addition, it's created a really difficult landscape for migration. We've seen and we've talked about the political backlash, and we've seen in the presidential proclamation this week how different immigration policies are being thought out on the back of a really huge recession. And that's difficult enough, but then we're having a lot of people are quite fearful about travel until there is a vaccine or some other things that would give them comfort to travel. And a lot of people want to work from home or actually work from anywhere. So all of that is very difficult, plus the quarantine measures and the health and safety measures that come with mobility now. So that's my first point. But I think the second point is that there has never been such a huge need for migration, and business recognize that. And I think some of the stars of COVID-19 and the whole pandemic were migrant workers across the world. I mean, particularly in the health and safety sector, but not just in health and safety. I think across many of the industries, we as a whole world have really relied on these people, and it has been amazing. And I think that it has shown the need for migration and the really valuable role that's played across numbers of sectors, but particularly agriculture and the health sector. And therefore, I think the third thing to say is that also I think there have been a much greater realization of the difficulties unregulated migration can cause, not unregulated in the sense of illegal migration, but not having the sorts of really good regulatory frameworks and partnerships that LAMP are advocating. And I think we've seen, a lot of difficulties caused in certain countries where they have low-paid migrants who've had been in crowded accommodation. They've had little access to healthcare, and they have been repatriated. And so I think there is a lot of public sympathy for that, and I think companies as well are much more aware of some of these issues. So my last point is that, I think the pandemic has really prompted and really pushed forward a lot of innovative and agile thinking about things. And into this space steps LAMP, which I think is just a marvelous opportunity to look at partnerships and migration partnerships. And I think employers be really welcoming all the ideas that are coming out of LAMP, because they recognize the need that was well set out in the opening. And I think that this is, a fantastic step forward as we move out of the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Julia. This has just been incredibly rich. We have roughly 15 minutes left. We've gotten a bunch of great questions from the online audience, and I just wanted to relay 3 of those that I found particularly salient. I'm just going to read them off quickly, of the 3 of them, and then ask one by one if any of the 5 of you would like to step forward and have a say. One is about healthcare workers in this, but the mobility of healthcare workers in the current crisis. What are the opportunities and challenges that the crisis presents for the mobility of healthcare workers in specifically? A second was about abuses in this sector. What would be the role of an organization like LAMP in addressing exploitation of low-wage, low-education workers moving around the world, which is sadly frequent. And the third is about was quite an interesting question, which is what country do you think does this best? And of course, I'd have to say Canada, just given who we've invited here. Even if Ratna weren't on this panel, I would say Canada simply because they have just been incredibly dynamic and innovative in a sector with badly needs innovation. A lot of it is due to Ratna herself. Korea and New Zealand also come to mind as countries that have really pointed out what's possible for other countries that are lagging behind. But just starting on healthcare workers, would anybody like to talk specifically about healthcare workers?
I'm quite oh, sorry. Maybe I could just say a couple of things about healthcare workers, and maybe then we can hand over to Canada. I mean, I think on healthcare workers, there has been really bad examples across the globe, how these have been the most needed people who've really given up their lives to help and save people during the pandemic. And yet they're subject in lots of countries to really quite unreasonable immigration requirements. And governments across the world have actually rethought of this and dealt with it. So just a really good example is that in the UK, that some of them were actually liable to pay healthcare charges themselves. And the government, under a lot of pressure, realized that this wasn't good, and they actually rode back from that. And I think that when LAMP is looking at the mobility partnerships, the sorts of things that they look at is, when a migrant goes to a country and then for circumstances outside their control, they are repatriated, how are they looked after during that repatriation? And I think those are many of the things that have been, exposed during the crisis that LAMP can cover for in the mobility partnerships.
Ratna, were you going to speak? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I was going to say that if anything, this crisis has brought front and center the need for healthcare workers. And, I will divide these, the opportunities and challenges into two different buckets. One is healthcare workers, healthcare attendants who work in long-term care homes, personal support workers who work at home with the senior citizens. So there's a bucket of challenges associated with those. And then there's another bucket of challenges associated with healthcare workers who are in different parts of the world, but because of licensing barriers and accreditation issues are left outside the tent. And this has been brought into rude display in the world, but it has also created an opportunity for some creative lifting of criteria. And I noticed Spain, Portugal, the state of New York, in Canada ourselves, we have again sort of put some sacred cows aside to make way. And I think it is this opportunity for LAMP, particularly, to roll all these points of light together and propose new governance mechanisms, not only to facilitate labor market migration from one country to another, but to also make sure that pathways to labor market participation are available. There's no point in having lots of labor migration when in the end the migrants, and let's call them that, are only able to practice or work in sectors that they are not educated for. In Canada, we've had a very rude awakening of this. Our long-term care homes are famously understaffed, and there's no medical professionals, whereas there are medical professionals who are used to, in fact, thrive in chaotic healthcare conditions to deliver healthcare needs. So all of a sudden, this possibility has opened up. And in terms of the healthcare attendants in the other bucket, I think we may finally, and I won't speak for the world, I'll speak for Canada, something I'm committed to, we may finally get rid of our addiction to skilled workers and skilled workers alone, because they get the benefit of rights and permanency, whereas others don't. And I believe we will come out of this crisis with new wisdom that the labor market functions in different ways, and we need to have a whole of labor market economy approach as a slice of the labor market economy approach.
Thank you so much. I see Lant raising his hand. We can't hear you.
I'd like to move to the question of abuses, because I think this is central to the vision of LAMP, which is I often talk about an industry for good needs a good industry. And what I mean by a good industry is an industry in which the rights of workers are protected wherever they are and aren't dependent on being in their home country. We know that workers who move, particularly on a temporary basis and aren't necessarily on a path to or endowed with citizenship rights in the country in which they're working, are extremely vulnerable. And hence, in order for this industry to really emerge and thrive, we need to develop an industry that has standards, that has modes of governance, and has mechanisms so that you eliminate the exploitation. And at the same time, the way to do that is to make it a regular industry, is to acknowledge that it is an industry, to acknowledge that the mobility industry, the moving of people across borders in order to carry out functions in various sectors like healthcare, like agriculture, is itself a professional and skilled industry, not just part of the sector. So the healthcare industry needn't and be responsible for all of the mechanisms of moving people. There is a mobility industry, and that needs to be a good industry. And an analogy I sometimes use is I've worked as mainly a development economist and hence traveled all over the world. And one of the things you almost take for granted is almost no what matter where you are in the world, you feel perfectly safe getting on an airplane. And there's a reason for that. The industry, the airline industry, has created a set of standards and practices that make the airline industry safe no matter where you are. So you get on an airplane in any country in the world, you feel confident, in part because, not just because you trust the regulation of the country, but because you trust that the industry that produces airlines, that runs airports, that operates airlines, sees it is in their collective interest to have an infrastructure of the industry that makes sure the industry is safe. I feel what LAMP is headed for is a similar infrastructure of the industry that makes sure that workers, when they move, are safe and protected and have their contractual obligations fulfilled and that they're treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve as they make their contributions. And that is an integral vision to an industry for good that meets the needs and at the same time is a good industry and is well regulated and well governed.
I'd like to briefly comment on that myself. Just a concrete example is the H-2 seasonal work visa in the United States is rife with abuse. The Urban Institute and others have documented that it's quite common, for example, for workers to be charged illegal fees. I should say fees that are illegal under US law by recruiters in Mexico, which is the predominant sending country. Now, Mexico unilaterally has no incentive to enforce US law in Mexico. The United States can't enforce US law in Mexico. How can those reasonable laws be enforced in Mexico? Exclusively through a bilateral agreement between the two countries. And we have a concrete proposal on that. The point of LAMP is to negotiate agreements of that kind, which are rights respecting and are sine qua non in many settings, like the one I mentioned and countless other ones around the world for protecting workers' rights. Another very thoughtful, interesting question came through. The way I'm getting the questions, people are not identified, and the other ones have been anonymous. I didn't mean to not mention who you are. I don't know who you are. This particular one came with a name, which is Manjula Luthria of the World Bank, who's one of the most knowledgeable people in the earth on putting together bilateral labor agreements that are mutually beneficial and rights respecting. She asks quite an interesting question about LAMP, which is that paraphrasing you, Manjula, she sees the binding constraint in many bilateral labor agreements around the world as one, how to build trust between the actors in origin and destination countries, and two, how to create public goods and services that last through political cycles. The question is, how could LAMP contribute to the building, to the easing of those two big binding constraints? Maybe a good one for Lent or Rebecca, but anyone is great to jump in.
Sure. Yeah, they're both excellent questions. Thank you, Manjula. In terms of trust, I think it's quite complicated, as I know you know from your own experience. And I think that it involves a really multifaceted approach. I think that one of the first steps of trust building would be getting everyone kind of on the same page in terms of the facts, right? So that's where your evidence gathering comes in. That's where your research comes in, and just guaranteeing across all parties that you kind of know how to guarantee that this program will work this way that you say it works. I think that a lot of it also goes to what Gonzalo has shared with us in terms of building a broad coalition, really deeply understanding the needs as well as the risks of those coalitions, and then building in mitigants to those risks into the design of your program. And I think that that's why one of the key elements of LAMP and its work is that it be adaptable to all kind of circumstances, so that you can really tailor-make the program to answer whatever it is that mitigates the risks and build those trusts across actors. Does someone want to take the employment services question?
I won't take the employment services question, but I will comment on trust. I think trust is based a great deal on shared benefits, where all the partners share to some extent in some benefits, if not all benefits. And at this point, we need an institution that brokers these shared benefits between the players in the market, so to say. So at this point, there are a few winners. Certainly sending countries over the long term are winners, and the migrants or immigrants themselves can be winners either in the short term or the long term, as Lance research has proved. It seems to me that the losers our sending countries. And if we are to create an industry for good and a good industry, then we have to make sure that trust is engendered by talking and negotiating these shared benefits.
Thank you so much. There's very little time left, so I wanted to, in the few minutes that we have left, because we haven't heard from you again, Gonzalo. I wanted to ask if you had a quick thought on the discussion so far, and then turn right to Lant and to Rebecca for closing thoughts.
No, I mean, I just want to take. This is related to some of the questions that have been made, but I do believe. I mean, we were having a conversation before these events about whether we are more optimistic or pessimistic in terms. And you mentioned that, Michael, at the beginning of the presentation. But I honestly think that we do have a window of opportunity now during the COVID crisis, and part of it is related to the question of the health professionals, and more broadly about the essential capacities that have surfaced during the crisis. I think that I mean, if you take the image of Boris Johnson going out of the hospital and thanking Jenny and Luis, the two nurses from New Zealand and Portugal that saved his life I think that was an epitome of something that has been felt across many other countries about the role that migrants play in this regard. And I think that we need to grab this opportunity. We need to grab the opportunity that because of the crisis, as we very well know, borders are pretty quiet right now. There is not so much pressure. And I think we do have an opportunity to make certain decisions and to start from here. And this is the way we approach a process like regularization, as an opportunity to reset. And I think that LAMP can help a lot in terms of resetting this. And the European Union is very much at a crossroads right now, maybe less so the United States. I mean, given that you are stuck in a very particular situation right now. But I think that we need to push for the ball to fall to the right side of the mountain. And right now, COVID provides an opportunity for all of us working in this reformist camp.
Thank you so much. Whenever I get depressed, I talk to Gonzalo, and it's a very different situation. Julia, any thought before we turn to Lant and Rebecca? And if not, that's absolutely fine. I just wanted to give you an opportunity.
I just want to say I just agree with so much with what's just been said. I mean, I think that, you know, it is a very complicated landscape. It's difficult times, but as you yourself said at the beginning, if we keep saying, oh well, this is a difficult time, we can't do anything, then we'll never do anything. So I think it's an opportunity.
Thank you so much. Lant and Rebecca, some closing thoughts?
Well, I think some closing thoughts are just, at the beginning, everything looks chaotic because there's so much that needs to be done, but there are many examples. When you think of when electricity first became an industry, one of the problems was that people would design electrical appliances for your household that were terribly designed and would catch on fire and burn your house down. And so the abuses, the heterogeneity and lack of regulation and standards for the industry was inhibiting the development of appliances. People were scared to have electricity and appliances in their house because they were legitimately scared of the issues that would arise. And the industry got together and said, here is how we're going to create a regulation so that any appliance, so you can trust that any appliance that comes into your house is safe. If you look at the automobile industry, the airline industry, the electricity, all of these industries have gone from a chaotic incipient phase to develop standards, associations, regulations, communities of practice that share norms that make the industry deserving of the trust and deserving of the support, and then therefore can take advantage of the massive opportunities that are created. So I think in some ways the goal is to create that kind of the sinews and infrastructure of an industry that will allow this industry to develop in a good way, avoid the abuses, and yet take advantage of the opportunities. And I think that opportunity is there. It's a long run opportunity. It's not going to happen in the next 6 months or in the next 18 months. But I think starting to build that is an important priority, because in the existing way, we're not taking advantage of a massive opportunity that's there that can benefit all sides.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Do you want to have a closing thought, and especially if you could mention to the audience the document that's released today?
Sure. Well, I think Lant has left us on a perfect note. So I think that really the only thing to say is that we hope that you will check out the report that was launched today on CGD's website. It covers all of this in much more depth. We know that this was a little bit of a whirlwind. And I think that the really more important thing to note is that this is our chaotic beginning. And if what you have heard today interests you, if you know of opportunities where people might want to begin working on this and really, digging their hands in, we would love for you to reach out to us. I think it's past time to get to work.
Thank you so much, all of you, to everyone who attended. I know many people are still in very precarious professional situations, and I just appreciate all the more you're taking an hour for us today. And to Rebecca, Lant, Ratna, Gonzalo, Julia, thank you so much for joining us. I don't think you can hear applause from from various parts of the world, but on their behalf, I thank all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.